Tonight, we're going to Finland in the summer of 1960. A country where in June the sun barely sets. It dips just below the horizon for a few hours and the sky turns a pale, silvery gray, not quite night, not quite day. The Finns call them white nights. The world goes silent, but it never goes dark. On one of those white nights, 4 teenagers rode their motorcycles to the shore of a lake 20 kilometers west of Helsinki. They pitched a tent on a small wooded peninsula, drank vodka, went fishing, and fell asleep. Sometime between 4 and 6 in the morning, someone cut the ropes of their tent, collapsed it onto them, and stabbed and bludgeoned them through the canvas as they lay trapped beneath it. 3 of them were dead by sunrise. The 4th was found lying on top of the collapsed tent, his jaw broken, his face swollen beyond recognition, unable to remember anything that had happened. The police arrived at noon. They did not seal the crime scene. They did not photograph it properly. They allowed dozens of people to walk through the area before anyone had recorded what was there. The murder weapons were never found. The missing belongings were never fully recovered, and the killer was never identified. Over the decades that followed, suspicion fell on a violent kiosk keeper who drowned himself in the same lake 9 years later. On a German-born man with alleged intelligence connections who appeared at a hospital the next morning with blood on his clothes. On a teenage criminal who hanged himself on the anniversary of the murders. And finally, 44 years after the killings, on the sole survivor himself, the boy who had been left alive in the wreckage of that tent. He was tried, he was acquitted, and the case returned to the silence it had come from. In the first half of this video, we'll go through what happened on that night at Lake Bodom, the 4 teenagers, the attack, the investigation that fell apart before it began, and the suspects who were never convicted. In the second half, we'll look at what the physical evidence and the pattern of violence might tell us about the kind of person who did this, what the differential injuries, the displaced objects, and the geometry of the attack can reveal about the mind behind it. Sit back and listen to the story of the Finnish Lake Bodom murders. Finland in 1960 was a country still finding its shape. 15 years had passed since the end of the Second World War, and the scars of that conflict were everywhere. In the war reparations still being paid to the Soviet Union, in the modest homes that had replaced the ones destroyed by bombing, and in the faces of the men who had come back from the front and never quite settled into peacetime. The country was poor by Western European standards. Most Finns still lived in rural communities, working the land or the forests. The Great Migration to the cities, the one that would transform Finland from a semi-agrarian society into a modern welfare state, was only just beginning. In 1960, more than a third of the population still made their living from agriculture. Families were large, homes were small. The post-war baby boom had filled the country with children, and there was never quite enough space for all of them. But something was shifting. American culture had begun to arrive, rock and roll on the radio, Hollywood films in the cinemas, a sense that the younger generation was growing up in a world that bore less and less resemblance to the one their parents had known. Teenagers in the cities were beginning to dress differently, talk differently, and spend their free time in ways that made their elders uneasy. And in Finland, free time in June meant one thing above all others. It meant getting outside. The Finnish summer is brief and extraordinary. After months of darkness, a winter in which the sun may rise for only a few hours, if it rises at all, the arrival of June feels almost violent. The days stretch out until they swallow the night entirely. In the southern part of the country, the sun dips below the horizon around 11 in the evening and rises again before 4 in the morning, and in between there is no true darkness. The sky turns a flat, luminous gray, bright enough to read by, quiet enough to feel like a kind of held breath. The Finns call these the white nights. They are beautiful and strange, and they make it difficult to sleep. The body does not know what to do with a night that never arrives. People stay up later than they should. Children play outside until their parents call them in. The whole country takes on a restless, unmoored quality, as if the ordinary rules of time have been briefly suspended. And because the summer is so short, 10 weeks, perhaps 12, before the cold returns, Finns spend as much of it outdoors as they possibly can. They swim in lakes, they fish, they gather berries and mushrooms from the forest, and they camp. Camping in Finland in 1960 was not the organized, permit-driven activity it would later become. Teenagers especially would ride out to lakes and forests on bicycles or motorcycles, pitch a tent wherever the ground was flat, and spend a night or a weekend by the water. It was ordinary, it was expected. It was what young people did when school ended and the white nights began. 20 kilometers west of Helsinki, in the municipality of Espoo, there was a lake called Bodom. It was not a large lake, roughly 3 kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide, but it was considered one of the prettiest in the area. The shoreline was ringed with birch and pine trees. The water was clean enough to swim in. Local families used it for fishing and rowing in the summer months, and in winter the surface froze thick enough to walk across. On the southern shore, near a manor house called Oida, there was a small recreational area where people came to swim and picnic. A gravel road led from the main highway down to the lake's edge, passing through a patch of forest that thinned out into a series of small clearings and peninsulas along the water. One of these peninsulas, a narrow finger of land extending into the lake, shaded by birch trees, was a known camping spot. It was not an official campground. There were no facilities, no caretaker, no one to check whether you were supposed to be there. But it was close enough to the road to reach easily and far enough from the nearest houses to feel private. It was the kind of place you might choose if you were 18 years old, if you had a motorcycle and a tent, and if you wanted to spend a Saturday night by the water with your friends. It was also, although the teenagers who chose it in June of 1960 had no way of knowing this, within 800 meters of a man who would become the most likely suspect in their murders. But that comes later. On the evening of the 4th of June, 1960, 4 teenagers from the city of Vantaa arrived at the south shore of Lake Bodom. They parked their motorcycles among the trees, carried their gear down to the peninsula, and began setting up camp. The white night was beginning, the sky was still bright, the lake was calm, and for the next few hours everything was exactly as it should have been. They were 2 couples and they were new to each other. Seppo Antero Boisman was 18 years old. He had just finished school and taken a summer job to help carry some of the financial weight at home. He was dating a girl named Anja Tulikimäki, who was 15. They had been together only a few weeks. Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson was also 18, and he was Seppo's best friend. The two had known each other for years, the kind of close, uncomplicated friendship that forms in adolescence and feels like it will last forever. Nils was dating a girl named Mela Ermeli Björklund, who was also 15. She and Tulikki were friends, and it was through that friendship that the 4 of them had come together as a group. The relationships were new enough to still carry the self-conscious electricity of early romance. All 4 of them were from Vantaa, a municipality just north of Helsinki. They were not from Espoo, they were not locals. They did not know the area around Lake Bodom the way the people who lived there did. Nils had been to the lake once before, on a fishing trip with friends, and it was his idea to bring the group there for a weekend of camping. They arrived on motorcycles on Saturday afternoon, the 4th of June. The weather was fine, the lake was still and clear. They stopped in town on the way to pick up food and alcohol, vodka and a bottle of liquor, and the girls drew some curious glances from the locals. Espoo was a small community. Everyone knew everyone. Outsiders were noticed. They found the spot Nils remembered, the small peninsula on the south shore, shaded by birch trees, with a clear view of the water. They set up their tent, a small canvas shelter designed for 2 people, but pressed into service for 4. It would be close quarters, but they were young and didn't mind. The girls went swimming. The water was cold, it was still early June, and the lake had only barely warmed from the winter, but they didn't stay in long. The boys sat on the shore, eating and drinking. Nils later recalled that by the afternoon, the other people who had been using the lake, swimmers, rowers, families with children, had all cleared out. The peninsula was empty except for the 4 of them. That evening, Björklund wrote in her diary. She noted, among other things, that the boys were drunk. It was a small detail, recorded without apparent alarm, just a 15-year-old girl observing her new boyfriend and his friend getting into the vodka. The diary would survive the night and become part of the evidence file. As the white night settled over the lake, the sky dimming to that pale gray half-light but never reaching true darkness, the girls went to bed first. Seppo stayed up. He was restless, unable to sleep. He told Nils he wanted to go fishing. Nils joined him, and the 2 boys sat on the shore of the lake in the not-quite darkness. drinking what remained of the liquor and talking. According to Björklund's diary, they left the tent around 2 in the morning. What they talked about, what Seppo was anxious about, whether they caught anything, none of this was ever recorded. The concerns that weighed on them were probably ordinary ones. They had just finished school. Summer jobs awaited. There was the question of what came next, the responsibilities of adulthood that were beginning to press down on them for the first time. Tuulikki had told Seppo that her father didn't want her to come on this trip, that something about it didn't sit right with him. Whether Seppo was thinking about that or about something else entirely is impossible to know. At some point, perhaps around 2:30, perhaps later, the boys returned to the tent and crawled inside. 4 teenagers in a space built for 2. Nils fell asleep next to Björklund, Seppo next to Meki. Nils would later say that his last memory was of falling asleep in the tent, the sound of the lake barely audible through the canvas, the gray light of the white night pressing in from outside. The next thing he would be aware of was waking up in a hospital bed with a broken jaw and no memory of what had happened in between. Everything else, everything that occurred between roughly 2:30 in the morning and 11 o'clock the following day, belongs to the dead and to whoever killed them. The attack came sometime between 4 and 6 in the morning on Sunday, the 5th of June, 1960. No one heard screaming, no one in the surrounding area reported any disturbance. Whatever happened inside that tent happened quickly, and it happened to people who were asleep, or nearly so, when it began. The physical evidence, reconstructed over the following days and then re-examined decades later, told the following story. Someone approached the tent from outside. They cut the guy ropes, the cords holding the tent upright, causing the canvas to collapse onto the 4 people sleeping beneath it. This was not accidental. It was the first act of the attack, and it served a clear tactical purpose. With the tent collapsed around them, the teenagers were tangled in fabric, disoriented, unable to see, unable to stand, unable to run. They were pinned in place. Then the attacker began stabbing and striking them through the canvas. 2 weapons were used. One was consistent with a large knife. The other was consistent with a heavy blunt instrument, possibly a large rock. The speed of the assault was extraordinary. The victims had almost no time to react or defend themselves, though the evidence would later show that at least some of them were awake when the blows fell. Seppo Boisman died from a combination of blunt trauma and stab wounds to the neck. He was found inside the tent, in roughly the same position he had been sleeping in, which suggested he had not moved far before dying. Anya Tuulikki-Meki received only blunt force injuries. She had no stab wounds at all. Her blanket showed signs that she had been awake during at least part of the attack and had struggled. Mela Ermeli Björklund suffered the worst of it. She received far more injuries than the other 2 combined, and many of them were inflicted after she was already dead. She was found partially outside the tent, undressed from the waist down, positioned in the opposite direction from the other victims. The evidence indicated she had been moved from her original sleeping position. Nils Gustafsson was found on top of the collapsed tent. He had fractures to his left jaw and cheekbone, bruising across his face, and a wound on his elbow. His knuckles were bruised and bloody, consistent with having struck something hard. But his injuries were notably different from those of the others. The medical examiners would later describe them as low-energy wounds, meaning that whatever struck him had not carried the same force as the blows that killed his companions. He had no fatal injuries. Whatever had happened to him, it was not the same thing that had happened to the others. He was unconscious when he was found, but he was alive. The first people to see the scene that morning were not police. They were not even adults. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, 2 16-year-old boys named Heikki Salonen and Kelvi Hallalainen were walking in the woods near the lake. They were bird watchers out early to observe the dawn chorus. As they passed near the campsite, Heikki heard a sound that seemed human, a voice or a groan. He looked in the direction of the sound and saw 2 motorcycles leaning against a tree, a collapsed tent, and a young man lying on top of it. He also saw something else, a man roughly 30 meters from the tent, walking away toward the eastern shore of the peninsula. The man was an adult, not a teenager, and he was wearing a light-colored shirt or jacket. He was not running. He was walking at a steady pace, moving away from the campsite. The boys did not approach. From where they stood, the scene looked like a camper waking up after a rough night. They assumed the man on top of the tent was simply a hiker or a drunk, and they continued on their way. Half an hour later, at approximately 6 in the morning, a 14-year-old boy named Olavi Kivilahti was walking to the lake to go fishing. He saw a man moving quickly along the shoreline about 50 meters away. He described the man as being between 20 and 30 years old, with a straight build, straight light brown hair combed back, dark trousers, and a light jacket. Olavi did not see the tent. He did not know anything was wrong. He simply noted the man and kept walking. At around 7 in the morning, Martin and Ruth Coley were out on the lake in a small boat with their 5-year-old daughter. They saw the collapsed tent from the water. They could make out feet protruding from the tangled canvas. They assumed there had been a fight among campers and chose not to get involved. At 10 o'clock, 3 teenagers approached the campsite and saw Nils lying on top of the collapsed tent in rough shape. According to their later testimony, he waved at them and spoke, but the words were incoherent, gibberish. They too assumed it had been a bad fight. They left without calling anyone. It was not until approximately 11 o'clock in the morning that someone finally understood what they were looking at. Esko Oiva Johansson was a carpenter who lived nearby. He had come to the lake for a swim, as he often did on Sunday mornings. He walked through the short patch of woods between the road and the water, and at first he saw what everyone else had seen, a collapsed tent, belongings scattered, what looked like the aftermath of a drunken evening. But Johansson walked closer than the others had, close enough to see the stains on the canvas, close enough to understand that the boy lying on top of the tent was gravely injured and barely breathing. As Johansson stood there, Nils Gustafsson took a sharp breath and gasped a single word, "help," before he then fell back into unconsciousness. Johansson ran to the nearest telephone and called the police. They arrived at noon, more than 6 hours after the birdwatchers had first seen the collapsed tent and at least 7 hours after the attack itself. By then, whatever trail the killer had left was already growing cold. What happened at Lake Bodom in the hours after the police arrived is almost as consequential as what happened during the attack itself. The officers who reached the site at noon on Sunday, the 5th of June, made a series of decisions, or more precisely, a series of failures to act that would cripple the investigation for the next 6 decades. They did not cordon off the crime scene. They did not photograph it systematically. They did not record the positions of the bodies, the tent, the scattered belongings, or the blood patterns in any thorough or methodical way. Instead, they allowed people in. Within hours of the police arriving, the area around the collapsed tent was filled with other officers, journalists, curious locals, and bystanders who had heard what had happened and come to see for themselves. People walked through the campsite. They stood where the attacker had stood. They stepped over evidence that had not yet been catalogued. And then the decision was made to call in soldiers to help search the surrounding woods and shoreline for the missing items, the motorcycle keys, the wallets, the clothing, the murder weapons. Military personnel fanned out across the area, moving through the brush and along the paths that led away from the campsite. Whatever fragile evidence the ground might have held, footprints, drag marks, the faint traces of someone moving through the forest in the hours before dawn, was trampled beyond recovery. This was not malice, it was not corruption. It was 1960, and the Finnish police in a small municipality like Espoo were not trained in the preservation of violent crime scenes. They had no forensic protocols of the kind that would become standard in later decades. They processed the scene the way they would process a traffic accident or a house fire, by looking at what was there, noting what seemed important, and then moving on. But a triple murder in a tent by a lake is not a traffic accident. The evidence at such a scene is fragile, contextual, and easily destroyed. The position of a shoe, the angle of a blood splash, the impression of a knee in soft earth. These things can speak, but only if someone is listening before they are erased. No one was listening, and by the time anyone thought to listen, it was far too late. What the police did manage to recover told a strange and contradictory story. The tent entrance had been zipped or tied shut at the time of the attack. There was no way out for the people inside once the canvas collapsed on them. The ropes had been cut from outside. The knife wounds and blunt force injuries had been delivered from outside through the fabric. Several items were missing from the campsite. The keys to both motorcycles were gone, though the motorcycles themselves had been left behind. Some clothing was missing. Wallets were missing. Gustafsson's shoes were not at the campsite. They were found approximately 500 meters away, partially hidden in the brush. They were covered in blood, but when tested decades later, the blood on them belonged only to the other victims. There was no blood from Gustafsson on the shoes, and no blood inside them either. This was a detail that would mean nothing in 1960 and everything in 2004. There was one other object found near the scene that did not seem to belong to any of the four teenagers. It was a pillowcase, not a regular one left out from sleeping, but one that had been folded into a kind of bundle, tied at the ends with string, and then cut open with a knife. It contained traces of blood and biological material. When DNA technology became available decades later, the pillowcase was tested and found to contain genetic material from Björklund and from an unknown fifth male who did not match any of the four teenagers. The identity of that fifth person has never been established. The murder weapons, the knife, and the blunt instrument were never found. The lake was dragged. The surrounding woods were searched by soldiers and volunteers. Nothing was recovered. Whoever had carried out the attack had taken both weapons with him when he left. Nils Gustafsson was taken to a hospital in Helsinki. He had a broken jaw, a fractured cheekbone, a dislocated lower jaw, and a concussion. He was in and out of consciousness for the first day. When he finally became coherent enough to speak, the police were waiting. He told them he could not remember what had happened. He remembered arriving at the lake. He remembered setting up the tent. He remembered fishing with Seppo in the early hours. He remembered falling asleep, and then nothing. The next thing he was aware of was the hospital room, the pain in his jaw, and the faces of his mother and the nurses looking down at him. The police pressed him repeatedly over days and weeks. They pressed him. And eventually, under hypnosis, a technique that was considered legitimate in 1960 but would later be discredited as unreliable, Nils began to recall fragments. He described hearing screams. He described seeing the tent being ripped open with a knife. He described a figure, a man with flowing blonde hair and large, staring eyes, entering through the torn canvas with a knife in one hand and what looked like a lead pipe in the other. A sketch artist was brought in, and based on Nils's description under hypnosis, a composite drawing was produced. It showed a man with a high forehead, deep-set eyes, a prominent chin, and an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between blank and menacing. The sketch looked like no one in particular, and then, weeks later, at the funeral of one of the victims, a photograph was taken of the crowd of mourners. In it, standing among the grieving families, was a man whose face bore a striking resemblance to the composite drawing. He was never identified. In a separate statement, not under hypnosis, Nils described the attacker as a figure clothed in black with bright red eyes. This description was consistent with someone in a state of extreme shock or delirium, seeing something real through the distortion of terror and head trauma. Or it was consistent with someone who had seen nothing at all and was constructing an image from fear and suggestion. The police did not know which interpretation to believe, and as the weeks passed and no suspect emerged, the case began to slip from their grasp. They had a destroyed crime scene. They had a survivor who could not reliably tell them what he had seen. They had missing weapons and displaced belongings that pointed in no clear direction. They had the descriptions from the birdwatchers and the young fisherman, a man in a light jacket, walking away, but no way to connect that figure to anyone specific. And they had an entire community of people in Espoo who were beginning to talk among themselves about who might have done this. Conversations that were happening in Swedish, a language that many of the Finnish-speaking investigators did not understand well, which meant that the local knowledge and suspicion circulating through the small town was not reaching the people conducting the investigation. By the end of the summer of 1960, the Lake Bodom case was not solved. It was not close to being solved. And the mistakes that had been made in the first hours, the failure to preserve, to record, to protect what the scene was trying to say, could never be undone. The evidence had spoken once, briefly, in the hours after the killing, and no one had been there to hear it. "800 meters from the place where the four teenagers pitched their tent, there was a small kiosk on the road that led down to the lake. It sold drinks, snacks, and basic supplies to the people who came to Oida for swimming and recreation. The man who ran it was named Carl Valdemar Gillström. The people of Espoo knew him as the Kiosk man, and they were afraid of him. Gillström was a Swedish-speaking Finn who had lived in the area for years. He had been admitted to a military mental hospital during the war, though his exact diagnosis would remain sealed in his medical records until 2019, 50 years after his death. What the people around him could observe without a diagnosis was enough. He was volatile, unpredictable, and capable of sudden and extreme aggression, followed by periods of calm in which he could appear almost normal, even charming. He considered the land around the lake to be his territory. He did not own it. He had no legal claim to it. But he behaved as though anyone who entered the area without his permission was trespassing, and he responded to that perceived trespass with escalating hostility. He threw rocks at children who cycled past his kiosk. He fired a shotgun at teenagers who rode mopeds on the road that ran past his property. He hid razor blades in apples, and he was known, above all else, for what he did to campers. Anyone who pitched a tent within range of his kiosk was at risk. Gyllström would approach in the night with a long knife and cut the guy ropes, collapsing the tent onto the people inside. Then he would stand there in the darkness and laugh as they struggled to free themselves from the fallen canvas. No one from Espoo would have camped at that spot on the south shore of Lake Bodom. The locals knew better. They knew that if you set up a tent anywhere near the kiosk man's territory, he would come for you. It was only outsiders, people who didn't know the area, people from other towns, who made that mistake. People like 4 teenagers from Vantaa who had been to the lake only once before. On the morning after the murders, police came to the area and took photographs of the local residents as part of their initial canvass. One of those photographs shows Gyllström, shirtless, leaning forward slightly, staring into the camera with an expression that is difficult to interpret. Suspicion, perhaps, or wariness, or something else entirely. The police searched his property briefly, they questioned him, and then they moved on. His wife told investigators that Gyllström had been in bed with her for the entire night of the 4th of June. He had not left the house. He could not have been at the lake. The police accepted this and turned their attention elsewhere. But the people of Espoo did not accept it. They talked among themselves in Swedish, the language of their community, a language that created a barrier between what the locals knew and what the Finnish-speaking investigators were able to learn. And what the locals said to each other was that they had seen Gyllström coming back from the direction of the murder scene in the early morning hours of the 5th of June. They said this to each other. They did not say it to the police, because the risk of what the kiosk man might do to them if he found out was too great. For 9 years, the situation remained like this. The case went cold. Gyllström continued to run his kiosk and terrorize the people around him. The murders were never far from the community's mind, but no one came forward publicly to point a finger at the man they suspected. And then, in 1969, something changed. According to the account that circulated afterward, Gyllström was drinking with a friend, a man named Burge, when he confessed to the murders. He told Burge that he had killed the teenagers at Lake Bodom. Burge did not believe him, or perhaps he did believe him but did not know what to do with the information. In either case, his response was blunt. He told Gyllström that if it was true, if he really had killed those children, then he should drown himself in the lake, because prison would be worse than death. Within hours, Carl Valdemar Gyllström walked to the shore of Lake Bodom and entered the water. His body was recovered shortly afterward. He was dead by drowning, and the death was ruled a probable suicide. He was not the only person connected to the case who died that year. Pentti Soinanen, a young man with a history of violent crime who had confessed to the murders while in prison in the mid-1960s, hanged himself on the 6th of June, 1969. The 9th anniversary of the killings, the police had never taken Soinanen's confession seriously. He would have been only 14 years old at the time of the murders, and it seemed implausible that a single boy of that age could have overpowered 4 older teenagers. But the date of his suicide was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. After Gyllström's death, 2 things happened that would not become widely known for decades. The first was that his wife, on her own deathbed some years later, retracted the alibi she had given him. She told a friend that Gyllström had not been in bed with her that night. She said he had threatened to kill her if she ever told the police the truth. She said she had been too afraid of him to do anything but lie. She died of cancer shortly after this confession and asked not to be buried in the same grave as her husband. The second was a detail reported by Gyllström's son-in-law, who claimed that in the days immediately following the murders, Gyllström had filled in a well on his property. a well that the son-in-law believed contained the murder weapons. The police had searched the property in 1960, but they had not excavated the well. By the time this claim became public, Gyllström was long dead, and the well was buried under decades of soil and construction. There was one more detail, a small one, but the kind that lingers. Every summer, for years after the murders, someone left fresh flowers in a small jar at the spot where the teenagers had been killed. The flowers were always the same variety, the same kind that grew in Carl Valdemar Gyllström's yard. After 1969, the year Gyllström drowned himself in the lake, the flowers stopped appearing. The police never tested Gyllström's DNA against the unknown fifth male profile found on the pillowcase at the crime scene. By the time DNA technology became available, Gyllström had been dead for decades. The only way to obtain a sample would be through a living relative, his son, who has refused to provide one. And so the question of whether the kiosk man killed the teenagers at Lake Bodom remains exactly where it has been since 1960, suspended between strong local conviction and a permanent absence of proof. The people of Espoo believe they know who did it. The evidence cannot confirm or deny what they believe. And the man at the center of it all is at the bottom of the same lake where the murders happened, as silent and inaccessible as the case itself. There was another suspect, one who attracted more public attention than Gyllström ever did, in part because he was stranger, more theatrical, and more difficult to pin down. His name was Hans Östman. He was German-born, a naturalized Finnish citizen who had lived in the country for approximately a decade by the time of the murders. He lived with his wife in a small house several kilometers from the shore of Lake Bodom, not as close as Gyllström, but well within the surrounding area. Östman was a man who cultivated an air of mystery and menace. He claimed, at various points in his life, to have been a former SS guard at Auschwitz and a KGB operative during the Cold War. Whether any of this was true is unclear. Some investigators believed it. Others considered him a fantasist and attention seeker who inflated his own history for the thrill of being feared. What is not in dispute is that on the morning of the 6th of June, 1960, the day after the murders, Hans Östman appeared at the Helsinki Surgical Hospital. He arrived in a state that the staff found immediately suspicious. His clothes were covered in red stains. His fingernails were caked with dirt, as though he had been digging in earth or clawing at the ground. His shoes were mudded and worn in a way that suggested he had been moving through rough terrain. He appeared to be unconscious when he arrived, but the staff suspected he was faking it. One doctor tested this theory by tickling him, which caused Östman to snap awake immediately. When the nurses tried to conduct an intake examination, he became hostile and aggressive, alternating between attempts to manipulate the staff and outbursts of anger. Dr. Jorma-Palo, one of the physicians who examined Östman that morning, made careful note of the stains on his clothing. He believed they were blood. He urged the police to take the clothing in for testing. They did not. This failure, the decision not to seize and test Östman's stained garments, would be cited for decades as one of the most significant missed opportunities in the investigation. When the composite sketch based on Nils Gustafsson's hypnosis sessions was released to the public, Östman reportedly cut his long blonde hair short within days. His previous appearance, the flowing blonde hair, the tall build, the prominent facial features, had been consistent with the descriptions given by the birdwatchers and the young fisherman who had seen a man leaving the area of the campsite on the morning of the murders. The police questioned Östman. He provided an alibi. He said he had not been at home on the night of the murders but had been with his mistress, a woman who lived elsewhere. The mistress confirmed this. Her brother, who had also been in the house that night, corroborated the story. The police accepted the alibi and did not pursue Östman further, but over the years, doubts accumulated. Östman had been a suspect in other violent crimes in Finland. Most notably, he was connected to the 1953 murder of Kalikisaari, a 17-year-old girl whose body was found in a bog after she disappeared while riding her bicycle home from church. Östman's car matched a vehicle seen near the area where Saari vanished. He was also linked to the Tulilahti campsite murders of 1959, another unsolved case involving young people killed outdoors. On his deathbed in Sweden in the late 1990s, Östman made a cryptic statement about the Saari case. He described it as an accident that had to be covered up and implied that he and a companion had been involved in the girl's death. He said it in a way that was both confessional and evasive, as though he wanted credit for the truth without ever stating it plainly. Some accounts suggest that Isman's wife, like Gillström's, retracted her husband's alibi late in life, though the sources on this point are less clear, and there is some confusion in the English language literature about which wife retracted which alibi. What is more firmly established is that Isman made drunken statements over the years that could be interpreted as confessions to the Bodom killings, though he always maintained enough ambiguity to avoid committing himself. The question of Isman's involvement lingered for decades, fueled by 3 books written by Dr. Jorma Palo and by the work of a former detective named Matti Paloro, who attempted to connect Isman to 5 unsolved homicides in Finland. Isman became the public's favorite suspect, the figure onto whom Finnish society projected its need for an answer. But in the early 2000s, when DNA technology was finally applied to the case, Isman's candidacy collapsed. His son submitted a pair of his father's old glasses to the police laboratory. The glasses had what appeared to be small specks of blood on them. When tested, the specks did yield human DNA, 2 separate male profiles. But neither profile matched any of the victims, and neither matched the unknown 5th male whose DNA had been found on the pillowcase at the crime scene. Hans Isman had not left his genetic material at Lake Bodom. Whatever he had been doing on the night of the 4th of June, wherever the red stains on his clothing had come from, the physical evidence could not connect him to the murders. He died in Sweden without ever being charged. His alibi was never definitively broken, and the DNA evidence, when it finally arrived, pointed away from him rather than toward him. The man at the hospital, for all the suspicion he attracted, was most likely not the man at the lake. But if it was not Gillström and it was not Isman, then the investigation had spent 4 decades pursuing shadows, while the real killer moved through the world unchallenged. And in 2004, the Finnish police decided they had been looking in the wrong direction the entire time. They believed the answer had been there from the beginning, lying on top of the tent, broken and bleeding, claiming not to remember. For more than 4 decades, Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson lived an unremarkable life. He recovered from his injuries, he married, he had 2 children. He held a job, raised his family, and grew old in the same country where, as an 18-year-old boy, he had been found unconscious on top of a collapsed tent with his 3 dead friends beneath him. He never spoke publicly about what had happened at Lake Bodom. When journalists or investigators came to him over the years, he repeated the same thing he had told the police in 1960, that he could not remember. The last thing he recalled was falling asleep. The next thing was the hospital. Everything between those 2 points remained blank. Some people found this suspicious. Others found it entirely consistent with the kind of traumatic amnesia that accompanies a severe concussion and the psychological shock of waking up in the middle of a massacre. The medical literature supported both interpretations. The police, for their part, had never charged him. He was listed as a victim. Then in late March of 2004, 44 years after the murders, Nils Gustafsson answered a knock at his door. It was the police. They had come with a warrant. He was 62 years old. He had been retired for some time. His children were grown. And the officers standing in his doorway told him he was being arrested for the murders of Seppo Boisman, Tuulikki Mäki, and Ermeli Björklund. The arrest was the result of a reopened investigation that had begun quietly in 2003. When the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation decided to apply modern forensic techniques to the physical evidence that had been preserved from the original crime scene. The centerpiece of the new analysis was Gustafsson's shoes, the pair that had been found 500 meters from the campsite in 1960, partially hidden in the brush. When subjected to DNA testing, the shoes revealed blood from all 3 murdered victims on their outer surfaces. But they contained no blood from Gustafsson himself, not on the outside, not on the inside, not anywhere. The prosecution's interpretation was as follows. If Gustafsson had been wearing his shoes during the attack, if he had been inside the tent alongside the others when the killer struck through the canvas, then his own blood should have been on the shoes along with everyone else's. The absence of his blood meant, according to the prosecution, that he had not been wearing the shoes at the time the other 3 were attacked. He had been wearing them at a different time. Specifically, he had been wearing them while he attacked the others. The theory the prosecution constructed went like this. At some point during the night, a confrontation occurred between Gustafsson and Boisman. Perhaps it was over Björklund. Perhaps Gustafsson had been drinking heavily and became aggressive. Perhaps Björklund had rejected him, or Boisman had intervened. Whatever the trigger, the two boys fought, and Boisman struck Gustafsson hard enough to fracture his jaw. Rather than calming down, Gustafsson escalated. He left the tent or was thrown out of it. He then attacked the other three from outside, stabbing and bludgeoning them through the collapsed canvas. He directed the worst of his violence at Björklund, his girlfriend, which explained why she had received far more injuries than the others and why many of her wounds had been inflicted after death. He then removed her clothing, staged certain elements of the scene, hid his shoes 500 meters away, returned barefoot to the campsite, inflicted additional injuries on himself, and collapsed on top of the tent to await discovery. In support of this theory, the prosecution offered several additional pieces of evidence. A police officer named Markku Tuomainen testified that upon his arrest in 2004, Gustafsson had made a remark that could be interpreted as incriminating. According to Tuomainen, Gustafsson said something to the effect of "what's done is done, 15 years came," a statement the prosecution took as an acknowledgement of guilt and an expectation of his sentence. A woman came forward who claimed to have been camping nearby on the night of the murders. She said she had seen Gustafsson and Boisman visit her tent that evening, and that Gustafsson had been behaving aggressively. She had not reported this in 1960. She had not reported it in the intervening 44 years. She came forward only in 2003 during a television documentary interview. And the birdwatchers from 1960, now elderly men, were asked whether the blond man they had seen walking away from the campsite could have been Gustafsson. The prosecution suggested it could have been him, disposing of evidence before returning to the scene to play the victim. The trial began on the 4th of August 2005 at the Espoo District Court. It drew enormous public attention. The case was already the most famous unsolved crime in Finnish history, and the idea that the survivor himself might have been the killer all along was sensational enough to dominate the national media for months. Gustafsson's defense lawyer, Rita Leppäniemi, dismantled the prosecution's case methodically. She argued that Gustafsson's injuries, particularly the fractured jaw, the dislocated lower jaw, and the facial fractures, made it physically impossible for him to have carried out a sustained, violent assault against three people. The pain alone would have been incapacitating. The loss of blood and the concussion would have left him unable to think clearly, walk steadily, or grip a weapon with force. She pointed out that Gustafsson's blood had been found inside the tent, which was consistent with him being attacked there alongside the others, not outside it looking in. She noted that the socks Gustafsson had been wearing showed no evidence of having walked 500 meters through the woods. If he had removed his shoes after the attack and then walked barefoot or in socks to hide them, there should have been dirt, debris, or blood transfer on his feet and socks consistent with that journey. There was not. She challenged the eyewitness testimony of the woman who had come forward after 45 years, pointing out that Björklund's own diary made no mention of visiting another tent that evening, and that the woman could not recall certain basic details about what she claimed to have seen. She challenged the officer's testimony about Gustafsson's alleged statement upon arrest, arguing that the phrasing was ambiguous and could just as easily be interpreted as a resigned prediction of what would happen to him, not an admission of what he had done. And she argued, simply and directly, that the prosecution had failed to establish a motive. A drunken argument between teenagers does not typically escalate into a triple murder. Whatever jealousy or frustration Gustafsson may have felt that night, if he felt any at all, it was not the kind of motive that explained the savagery of what had been done to those three bodies. On the 7th of October 2005, the court delivered its verdict, not guilty on all charges. The judges explained that the evidence was inconclusive, that the prosecution had failed to demonstrate a motive commensurate with the severity of the crime, and that the passage of 44 years had made it impossible to establish the facts with the certainty required for a conviction. Nils Gustafsson was released. The Finnish state paid him €44,900 in compensation for the mental suffering caused by his time in custody and the trial. He returned to his life. He did not speak to the press. He did not write a book. He simply went home. And the case of the Lake Bodom murders returned to the same silence it had occupied for 4 decades, unsolved, unexplained, and no closer to resolution than it had been on the afternoon of the 5th of June, 1960, when the police arrived 6 hours too late and found a destroyed crime scene with no killer in it. The kiosk man was dead at the bottom of the lake. Hans Ösman was dead in Sweden. Pentti Soinanen was dead at the end of a rope. Nils Gustafsson had been tried and acquitted, and the unknown 5th male whose DNA sat on a pillowcase in a Finnish evidence locker had never been identified at all. Every path that the investigation had followed over 65 years had led to the same place, a dead end at the edge of the water. That is what happened at Lake Bodom. The 4 teenagers, the white knight, the collapsed tent, the investigation that never recovered from its own first hours, and the suspects who were never convicted. But knowing what happened does not answer the deeper questions. Why did the attacker cut the tent ropes first, collapsing the canvas onto the victims before striking, when it would have been simpler to enter through the opening? Why did one victim receive injuries far beyond what was needed to kill her, while another was killed with relatively little force? Why were the shoes carried 500 meters into the woods and hidden, while the motorcycles were left untouched? Why was a pillowcase tied, cut open, containing traces of an unknown man, left at a scene where every other personal item was either stolen or scattered? And what does the pattern of violence itself, who was struck hardest, who was spared, who was left alive, tell us about the relationship between the killer and the people in that tent? In part 2, we are going to go through the psychology behind this case. Not to solve it, the physical evidence is too degraded, too contaminated, and too old for that, but to understand what the killer's behavior might reveal about the kind of mind that did this. What the geometry of the attack tells us about where the killer was standing and who he was focused on. What the differential violence suggests about his relationship to each victim. What the displaced objects reveal about his state of mind in the minutes after the killing. And why this case, after more than 65 years, still holds an entire country in its grip. The single most important question in the Lake Bodom case is not who did it. It is where the killer was when he began. Was he outside the tent, attacking strangers through canvas in the dark? Or was he inside it, one of the 4 people who had gone to sleep there, turning on the people beside him? The physical evidence points in both directions, which is precisely why the case has never been resolved. But the geometry of the attack, the spatial arrangement of the bodies, the direction of the blows, the sequence of events that can be reconstructed from the injuries, tells us things that the DNA and the testimony cannot. The tent was small. It was designed for 2 people, not 4. The 4 teenagers were packed tightly together, lying side by side in a space that offered almost no room to move. This matters enormously because it dictates what was physically possible for anyone, inside or outside, to do. An attacker operating from outside the tent would have had several advantages. He could move freely. He could choose his angle. He could strike downward through the canvas with the full weight of his body behind each blow. And critically, he could see the shapes of the bodies beneath the fabric, the outlines of heads, torsos, limbs, well enough to aim his strikes, particularly in the gray light of a Finnish white night that never fully darkened. An attacker operating from inside the tent would have had almost none of these advantages. He would have been tangled in the same fabric as his victims once the tent collapsed. He would have been in physical contact with the people he was attacking. His range of motion for swinging a weapon would have been severely restricted by the confined space and the fallen canvas pressing down on everyone inside. The evidence from 1960 consistently indicated that the blows came from outside. The tent ropes were cut first, a deliberate act that required being outside the tent with a blade. The stab wounds were delivered through the canvas from above. The blunt force injuries were consistent with downward strikes from a standing or kneeling position, not with the restricted, lateral movements that would be available to someone lying inside a collapsed tent. The prosecution in 2005 attempted to work around this by suggesting that Gustafsson had been outside the tent at the time of the attack, that he had been expelled from it after a fight with Boisman, and had then attacked from the exterior. This preserved the outside attacker geometry while placing the killer within the group. But this theory introduced its own problems. If Gustafsson was outside the tent and attacking through the canvas, he was attacking people he could not clearly see. The tent was collapsed, the bodies were beneath the fabric. In the gray half-light of a Finnish June morning, he would have been striking at shapes, unable to distinguish one person from another with any certainty. And yet the distribution of injuries was not random, it was highly specific. Björklund received far more violence than anyone else. Mäki received the least. Boisman was between the two. If the attacker was striking blindly through canvas at indistinguishable shapes, this differential pattern becomes difficult to explain. It suggests someone who knew exactly where each person was lying and who could direct his violence with precision toward a specific target. This is where the two theories diverge most sharply. If the attacker was an outsider, someone who had never been inside the tent and did not know the sleeping arrangement, then the differential violence becomes almost inexplicable. A stranger attacking four shapes beneath a collapsed tent in semi-darkness would have no way of knowing which shape was which. His violence would be distributed more or less evenly, or at most concentrated on whichever body was closest to him or most accessible. If the attacker was someone who knew exactly who was sleeping where, someone who had been in the tent earlier that evening, or someone who had been told the arrangement, or someone who had observed the group closely enough to know their positions, then the differential violence makes perfect sense. He could target one person specifically. He could direct the full force of his rage at her, and deal with the others only to the extent necessary to prevent them from escaping or fighting back. In behavioral analysis, the spatial precision of violence is one of the most reliable indicators of the relationship between attacker and victim. When violence is targeted, when one person receives dramatically more injury than others in the same location, it almost always indicates a personal connection. The killer is not attacking a group. He is attacking one specific person within a group, and the others are obstacles or witnesses who must be dealt with but who are not the focus of his rage. The geometry of the Lake Bodom tent points strongly toward a targeted attack on Mela Ermeli Björklund. She was the epicenter of the violence. She received the most blows. She received the most stab wounds. She was the only one whose injuries continued after death. She was the only one whose body was moved, undressed, and positioned differently from where she had been sleeping. Everything else that happened inside that tent, the deaths of Boisman and Mäki, the injuries to Gustafsson, radiates outward from that center. They are not the point of the attack, they are the consequences of it. This does not tell us who the attacker was. An outsider who was obsessed with Björklund specifically could have targeted her. A member of the group who had a personal grievance with her could have targeted her. The geometry alone cannot distinguish between these possibilities. But it does tell us something that narrows the field considerably. Whoever killed the teenagers at Lake Bodom did not attack them indiscriminately. He did not simply explode in undirected rage against four interchangeable targets. He went to that tent or rose up within it with a specific person in mind. And the things he did to her, even after she was dead, suggest that whatever was driving him went far beyond the desire to end her life. In forensic behavioral analysis, there is a term for what was done to Mela Ermeli Björklund. It is called overkill. Overkill does not simply mean excessive violence. It means violence that continues far beyond the point at which the victim is dead, violence that serves no practical purpose, that does not help the killer accomplish his goal, and that continues only because something inside him requires it to continue. Björklund was struck in the head at least 3 times with a blunt instrument. She was stabbed in the neck approximately 15 times. Many of those stab wounds were inflicted after she was already dead. The attacker kept driving the blade into her body even after life had left it, not because she was still a threat, not because she might recover, but because the act of harming her had become its own purpose. By contrast, Tuulikki Mäki was killed with blunt force alone. She had no stab wounds at all. She died from head injuries and nothing more. The attacker struck her until she stopped moving, and then he stopped. He did what was necessary to end her life, and nothing beyond that. Seppo Boisman fell between the two, more violence than Mäki received, less than Björklund. He had both blunt trauma and stab wounds, but not the prolonged, post-mortem assault that characterized what was done to Björklund. This differential pattern is one of the most important pieces of behavioral evidence in the entire case. It tells us that the attacker did not experience the same emotional state toward each victim. His relationship to each of them, whatever that relationship was, produced a different level of violence, a different degree of rage, a different need. In criminal psychology, overkill is almost always personal. When a killer directs dramatically more violence toward one victim than toward others in the same incident, it nearly always indicates that the primary victim holds a specific psychological significance for the attacker. She's not interchangeable, she's not a random target. She's someone who provokes in the killer a level of emotion, whether rage, jealousy, hatred, sexual obsession, or some combination of these, that the other victims do not provoke. This does not necessarily mean the attacker knew her well. It does not even necessarily mean he had met her. Personal significance in this context refers to the role the victim occupies in the killer's psychological world, which may be based on real interaction, or on fantasy, or on a symbolic association that exists only in the killer's mind. But in the Lake Bodom case, the simplest interpretation is usually the one that forensic psychologists reach for first. The person who received the most violence was the girlfriend of the person who survived. This is the fact that the prosecution built its entire case around in 2005. It is also the fact that anyone analyzing the behavioral evidence must confront honestly, regardless of whether they believe Gustafsson was guilty. If an outside attacker killed these 4 teenagers, then his specific focus on Björklund requires an explanation. Why her? What did she represent to him? How did he know which person she was beneath the collapsed canvas? Or did he discover her identity only after the tent was down and he could see who was who? One possibility is that the attacker had been watching the group during the evening. From the cover of the surrounding trees in the extended daylight of a Finnish white night, he could have observed them for hours, learning who was who, which couple was which, where each person was likely to sleep relative to the tent opening. If the attacker was Gillström, who lived 800 meters away and had a documented obsession with campers on his territory, this kind of prolonged observation is not difficult to imagine. Another possibility is that the differential violence was not planned, but emerged during the attack itself. Perhaps the attacker entered a frenzy state and directed most of his violence at whoever was closest to him or whoever struggled the most. Björklund's position, partially outside the tent, moved from her original location, might indicate that she attempted to escape, drawing the attacker's focus and his rage. But the post-mortem stabbing complicates this interpretation. Continuing to stab someone after they are dead is not a response to resistance. The victim is no longer resisting. She is no longer moving or screaming or trying to escape. The attacker is stabbing a body, and he is choosing to do so, choosing to continue, for reasons that have nothing to do with the practical need to subdue or silence. Post-mortem violence is one of the clearest indicators in forensic psychology that the act of destruction itself has become rewarding for the killer. The violence is no longer a means to an end, it has become the end. Something about the act of penetrating the body with a blade is satisfying a need that the death alone did not satisfy. In cases of intimate partner violence, where a man kills a woman he has been in a romantic or sexual relationship with, post-mortem overkill is strikingly common. It appears in a disproportionate number of femicides worldwide. Researchers believe it reflects the continued presence of rage, even after the perceived source of that rage has been eliminated. The woman is dead, but the feeling that drove the killer to attack her is still present, still demanding expression, still unsatisfied. And so the violence continues until the feeling exhausts itself. This pattern is consistent with the prosecution's theory of Gustafsson, a young man in a new relationship, drunk, jealous, rejected, who erupted in violence against the girl who had hurt him and could not stop even after she was dead. But it is also consistent with other scenarios. A stranger who had developed a fixation on Björklund, perhaps from observing her at the lake that afternoon, could have experienced a similar psychological state. A man whose violence was driven by sexual compulsion, rather than personal grievance, could have focused on her for reasons entirely unrelated to their relationship. The differential violence tells us that this was personal in the psychological sense. It does not tell us that it was personal in the relational sense. The distinction matters. What it does tell us, with something approaching certainty, is that whoever killed these 4 teenagers was not acting in undifferentiated rage. He was not simply a violent man who exploded and attacked everyone equally. He was a person with a specific target, a specific focus, and a specific emotional relationship to at least one of the people in that tent. The others died because they were there. Björklund died because she was who she was. Or more precisely, because of what she meant to the person who killed her. There is no neutral way to discuss Nils Gustafsson. He is either a victim who lost his 3 closest friends in an act of incomprehensible violence and then spent 44 years under a cloud of suspicion that culminated in a criminal trial for murders he did not commit. Or he is a killer who has successfully maintained his innocence for more than 6 decades, shielded by traumatic amnesia that may or may not be genuine, and by a crime scene so badly mishandled that the truth could never be reconstructed. The court found him not guilty. That is the legal resolution, but the psychological questions raised by his survival remain regardless of the verdict, and they are worth examining honestly. In cases of mass violence where a single survivor emerges, particularly when that survivor was in the same physical location as the victims, forensic psychologists always ask the same question: why did this person live when the others died? The answer is sometimes obvious: a victim who was farther from the attacker, a victim who was shielded by another body. A victim who was smaller and therefore less visible beneath the debris. A victim who played dead convincingly enough that the attacker moved on. In the Lake Bodom case, the answer is not obvious. Gustafsson was not farther from the attacker. He was in the same small tent, pressed shoulder to shoulder with the others. He was not smaller, he was one of the 2 18-year-old males, physically the largest people present. He was not shielded, he was found on top of the tent, the most exposed position of all. And his injuries, while real, were qualitatively different from those of the people who died. The medical examiners described them as low-energy wounds. His jaw was broken, but his skull was not crushed. He was bruised, but he was not stabbed in the neck. He had a wound on his elbow, but he did not have the kind of deep, fatal injuries that killed the other 3 in minutes. There are several possible explanations for this. The first is that the attacker believed Gustafsson was dead. In the chaos of a nighttime attack through collapsed canvas, striking at bodies beneath fabric, unable to clearly see the results of each blow, it is possible that the attacker landed a few strikes on Gustafsson, saw him go limp, and assumed he was finished. This is consistent with Gustafsson's own account, that he was attacked first and believed the killer thought he was dead. The second is that the attacker was interrupted. Something caused him to stop before finishing Gustafsson, a sound from the woods, the approach of dawn, a sudden fear of discovery. He had completed what he needed to do with the other 3 and left before dealing with the 4th. The third is that the attacker deliberately chose not to kill Gustafsson. This is the most disturbing possibility, because it implies that the killer made a conscious distinction between Gustafsson and the others, that Gustafsson occupied a different category in the attacker's mind, one that did not require his death. If the attacker was a stranger, Gillström, Isman, an unknown person, then the deliberate sparing of Gustafsson is difficult to explain. Why would a stranger care whether one particular teenager lived or died, unless the attack was directed specifically at the others and Gustafsson's survival was, in a sense, the point? If the attacker was Gustafsson himself, then the injuries he sustained need a different explanation entirely. The prosecution argued they were self-inflicted, or the result of a fight with Boisman that preceded the murders. The defense argued they were too severe, particularly the jaw fractures, to have been self-inflicted, and that the concussion and blood loss would have left him incapable of the sustained violence required to kill 3 people. In forensic psychology, there is a concept called staging, the deliberate manipulation of a crime scene to mislead investigators about what actually happened. Self-injury is one of the most common forms of staging in cases where a perpetrator wishes to appear as a victim. The perpetrator inflicts wounds on himself that are painful and visible but not life-threatening, then positions himself at the scene in a way that suggests he was attacked alongside the others. Self-inflicted injuries in staging cases tend to share certain characteristics. They are usually located on areas of the body that the person can reach and control: the forearms, the legs, the abdomen. They tend to avoid the face, the head, and the hands, because these areas are difficult to injure with precision and carry a high risk of accidentally causing more damage than intended. Gustafsson's injuries do not fit this pattern cleanly. His fractures were to the face and jaw, areas that are extremely difficult to injure oneself without a high risk of losing consciousness or causing permanent damage. The prosecution suggested that Boisman had inflicted these injuries during a fight and that Gustafsson then escalated to murder. This is possible, but it requires believing that a man with a freshly broken jaw and dislocated mandible then carried out a sustained attack requiring significant physical strength and coordination, an assumption that the court found unconvincing. There is a fourth possibility that is rarely discussed but that a forensic psychologist would note. It is possible that Gustafsson's amnesia is genuine, that the concussion he received erased his memory of the attack completely, and that his inability to remember is neither a performance nor a cover, but simply what happens to the human brain when it sustains a sufficient impact. Traumatic amnesia is well documented in medical literature. It is particularly common in cases of blunt force trauma to the head, and it can erase minutes or hours of memory surrounding the event. The person does not remember the trauma because the brain was physically unable to encode the memory at the time it occurred. If this is what happened to Gustafsson, then he is in a genuinely tragic position. He cannot remember whether he killed his friends. He cannot prove his innocence by offering an alternative account because he has no account to offer. He can only point to the physical evidence, his injuries, his blood inside the tent, the absence of a credible motive, and hope that it is enough. When a reporter asked him during the trial how he could know he was innocent if he could not remember anything, he replied simply, "I'm innocent, that's that." It is a statement that can be read as the quiet certainty of a man who knows himself, or as the careful performance of someone who has had 60 years to rehearse. The evidence cannot distinguish between these readings. The court decided that the prosecution had not proven its case. But the court did not say Gustafsson was innocent. It said the evidence was inconclusive. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. And that difference is part of why the case has never stopped haunting the people of Finland. The survivor lives in a space between proven guilt and proven innocence, a space where certainty is impossible and where the mind is left to circle the same questions endlessly, finding no resting place. After the killing was over, certain objects were displaced from the campsite. Their movement tells a story, though it is a story that can be read in more than one way. The motorcycle keys were taken. The motorcycles themselves were left behind. Clothing was scattered or removed. Wallets disappeared. And Gustafsson's shoes were carried approximately 500 meters into the surrounding woods and partially hidden in the brush. None of this makes straightforward sense under any theory. If the killer was a stranger, someone motivated by territorial rage, or by sexual compulsion, or by some other internal drive, then the theft of keys and wallets is difficult to explain. A man who has just committed a frenzied attack on sleeping teenagers does not typically pause to collect their valuables. The killing itself was not a robbery. Nothing about the manner of death suggests that the attacker was there to steal. The objects were taken after the violence, not before it, and they were taken selectively: keys but not motorcycles, wallets but not all clothing, shoes but only one pair. In criminal psychology, when objects are taken from a crime scene in ways that do not serve any clear practical purpose, the behavior is usually classified as one of two things. The first is trophy taking. A trophy is an object that the killer keeps because it holds personal significance. It reminds him of the crime. It allows him to relive the experience. It serves as a tangible connection to the victim. Killers who take trophies typically keep them. They do not hide them 500 meters away in the woods. The second is souveniring or displacement behavior, the movement of objects during a confused, dissociative, or adrenaline-saturated psychological state. In this interpretation, the killer takes things not because he wants them, but because he is acting without clear purpose in the immediate aftermath of extreme violence. His mind is not functioning rationally. He grabs things, he moves things. He carries items away from the scene without knowing why and deposits them when the impulse passes. This second interpretation fits the Lake Bodom evidence more closely. The objects were not kept, they were hidden poorly or scattered. The motorcycle keys served no purpose without the motorcycles, and yet they were taken. The shoes were carried a long distance and concealed, but not well enough to avoid being found. This pattern suggests a mind in disarray. not planning, not strategizing, but moving through the aftermath of violence in a state that resembles sleepwalking more than rational thought. The shoes are the most significant displaced object in the case, because they are the one piece of physical evidence that could theoretically resolve the central question of the investigation. If Gustafsson was the killer, then the shoes tell a relatively clear story. He wore them during the attack. The victim's blood landed on the outside. His own blood did not, because his injuries came earlier, during the fight with Boisman that preceded the murders. After the killing was over, he walked into the woods, hid the shoes, came back barefoot, and positioned himself on the collapsed tent. The absence of his blood on the shoes places him outside the tent, wearing them, at the time the others were bleeding. If Gustafsson was not the killer, then the shoes tell a much stranger story. The attacker, whoever he was, either put on Gustafsson's shoes before the attack, or removed them from Gustafsson's feet during the attack, or found them near the tent and wore them during the assault. He then carried them 500 meters away and hid them. This is unusual behavior for a stranger. It suggests either a deliberate attempt to frame Gustafsson, or the kind of irrational displacement behavior described above, the killer grabbing objects and moving them without clear purpose. The prosecution in 2005 argued that the simpler explanation was the correct one. The shoes were Gustafsson's, the blood on them was the victim's. The absence of Gustafsson's blood placed him as the wearer, not the victim. Therefore, Gustafsson was the killer. The defense argued that the shoes had been inside the tent during the attack and had been splashed with blood without being worn, that their position on the tent floor was sufficient to explain the blood patterns. They also pointed out that Gustafsson's socks showed no evidence of having walked through 500 meters of woods, which would be expected if he had removed the shoes at the scene and then carried them barefoot to the hiding spot. Both interpretations are physically possible, neither is conclusive. And then there is the pillowcase. It was found near the scene, a pillowcase that had been folded into a kind of bundle, tied at both ends with string, and then cut open with a knife. It contained biological traces from Björklund and DNA from an unknown fifth male who has never been identified. The police concluded that the pillowcase was unrelated to the crime, but this conclusion has always been controversial. An object containing the victim's biological material and an unknown person's DNA found at a crime scene is difficult to dismiss as coincidence, particularly when the unknown DNA matches no one who has ever been connected to the case. If the pillowcase belonged to the killer, if it was something he brought with him or something he created at the scene, then it suggests a level of preparation or ritual that does not fit neatly with any of the named suspects. A territorial rage killing by a man like Gillström does not typically involve bringing prepared bundles to the scene. A drunken eruption by a teenager like Gustafsson does not typically involve tying string around fabric and cutting it open with a knife. The pillowcase suggests a third possibility that has never been fully explored, that the killer was someone else entirely, someone unknown. Someone whose identity was never established because the investigation was so badly compromised in its first hours that the trail went cold before it could be followed. In forensic psychology, displaced objects at crime scenes are sometimes described as the killer's unconscious signature, actions taken not because they serve the crime, but because they serve the killer's psychological needs in ways he himself may not fully understand. They are the residue of a mind under extreme pressure, acting out patterns that reveal more about his internal state than any deliberate plan. The objects that moved at Lake Bodom do not solve the case, but they tell us something about the mind that moved them. They tell us that in the minutes after the killing, whenever the last blow fell and the campsite went quiet, the person responsible was not thinking clearly. He was not cleaning up efficiently. He was not covering his tracks with the cold precision of a calculating criminal. He was taking things, moving things, hiding things, and then leaving them where they would eventually be found. Whatever clarity had driven the attack, the precision of targeting Björklund, the tactical decision to collapse the tent first, had dissolved in the aftermath. The killer was no longer in control of what he was doing. He was being carried by impulses he could not explain, performing actions that served no purpose he could articulate. And then he walked away, into the gray light of a Finnish morning that refused to become night, and he disappeared. More than 65 years have passed since the night of the 4th of June, 1960. Every suspect is either dead or acquitted. The murder weapons were never found. The crime scene was destroyed within hours of discovery. The unknown fifth male, whose DNA sits in a Finnish evidence locker, has never been matched to anyone. The tent, torn, blood-stained, and folded into storage, is preserved behind glass at the police museum in Tampere, where visitors can look at it but learn nothing from it that has not already been learned. And yet Finland cannot let this case go. 3 generations of Finnish children have grown up being told not to stay out after dark because of the Bodom murderer. Parents have used the case the way parents in other countries use fairy tales about wolves in the forest, as a warning, a boundary, a way of saying that the world outside the home is not always safe. The killer became a kind of national boogeyman, less a real person than an embodiment of a fear that had never been given a face or a name. A heavy metal band from Espoo, the same town where the murders occurred, named themselves Children of Bodom and built a career on the mythology of the case. They released an album called Holiday at Lake Bodom. They brewed a beer using water from the lake itself. The case had become something that could be consumed, turned into entertainment, merchandised, absorbed into the culture as a dark landmark rather than an open wound. A feature film was made in 2016. Books have been published in Finnish, Swedish, and English. Podcasts have devoted episodes to it. In 2019, archaeology students from the University of Helsinki conducted a dig at the campsite, not looking for murder evidence, but for the remnants of what visitors had left behind over the decades, drawn to the site by the same dark gravity that draws people to the locations of famous crimes all over the world. And every year on the anniversary of the murders, people camp at the spot where the tent was pitched. They come to the peninsula on the south shore, set up their own tents, and spend the night there, sleeping, or trying to sleep, in the same place where 4 teenagers were attacked in the summer of 1960. The question is why, not why the murders happened. That is a question for forensic psychology, and we have spent the better part of this video trying to answer it. The question is why this case, above all others in Finnish criminal history, has embedded itself so deeply in the national consciousness that it has become something closer to mythology than to memory. Part of the answer is the Zeigarnik effect, the same psychological principle that explains why unsolved cases persist in the mind long after solved ones have faded. When a narrative reaches its conclusion, when the killer is identified, tried, and sentenced, the brain files it away. The tension dissolves, the story is finished, and the mind can release it. When a narrative remains incomplete, when the ending never arrives, the brain cannot let it go. It keeps the story active. It returns to it periodically, unbidden, searching for the resolution that will allow it to finally close the file. The Lake Bodom case is one of the most powerful open loops in European criminal history. It has all the elements of a complete story: victims, a crime, suspects, a trial, but it lacks the one element that the brain requires in order to feel finished. It has no ending. No conviction, no name attached to the violence, no moment at which the country could collectively say, this is who did it, this is why, and now it is over. The 2005 trial briefly offered the possibility of that ending. For a few months, it seemed as though the case might finally close, that Gustafsson would be convicted, that the loop would be completed, that Finland could stop asking the question it had been asking for 44 years. When the acquittal came, the country was left in a worse position than before. The trial had not merely failed to provide an answer. It had eliminated the last remaining candidate for an answer. The loop was not just open. It was open, and there was no one left to close it. But the Zeigarnik effect alone does not explain the depth of this case's hold on Finland. Other countries have unsolved murders. Other cases remain open for decades. What makes Lake Bodom different is the particular nature of the fear it introduced. The victims were teenagers. They were camping. They were doing something that every Finnish teenager did in the summer, something ordinary, wholesome, and expected. They were not engaged in risky behavior. They were not in a dangerous place. They were at a lake, in a tent, in a country where violent crime was exceptionally rare, and where the natural world was considered a place of safety and restoration. The murders did not just kill 4 people. They contaminated an experience. They made the ordinary dangerous. They took something that was part of the Finnish national identity, the summer lake, the tent, the white night, and attached a permanent shadow to it. This is what psychologists call a schema violation. A schema is a mental framework, a set of expectations about how the world works. When a schema is violated, when something happens that should not be possible within your understanding of reality, the mind struggles to integrate it. The event does not fit into existing categories. It remains foreign, unprocessed, permanently jarring. Before Lake Bodom, the Finnish schema for camping at a lake was simple. It was safe. It was part of being Finnish. It was what you did. After Lake Bodom, that schema carried a fracture. Camping was still safe, statistically, overwhelmingly safe, but the possibility that it might not be had been introduced, and it could not be removed. The fracture was permanent. This is compounded by the fact that the killer was never identified. When a killer is caught, the schema can repair itself. The event is explained. It was this specific person with this specific pathology, and he has been removed from the world. The violation was an anomaly, terrible but containable. When the killer is never caught, the schema cannot repair. The violation remains unexplained. The world proved itself to be more dangerous than you believed, and no one has been able to tell you why or assure you that it will not happen again. Finland has lived with that unrepaired schema for 65 years. The killer of the Lake Bodom teenagers could have been anyone. He could have been the Kiosk man who drowned himself in the same lake. He could have been the German with blood on his clothes. He could have been the surviving boy who went on to live an unremarkable life. He could have been someone whose name was never written down in any report, who passed through the area that night and was never seen again. The absence of an answer means that the fear has never been contained. It has never been given a box to fit inside. It has remained loose, floating through the culture, attaching itself to summer nights and lake shores and the sound of tent canvas flapping in the wind. The moonlight towers of Austin were built to eliminate the darkness that a killer had used as cover. Finland's response was different. Finland did not build anything. It could not illuminate the white night. The night was already bright. Instead, the country absorbed the case into its folklore, its popular culture, its parenting, and its sense of itself. The murders became part of what it meant to be Finnish, not because Finland is a violent place, but precisely because it is not. The anomaly stood out against the background of safety so starkly that it could never be normalized or forgotten. And so the case persists, not as an active investigation. There is no detective assigned to it, no new leads being pursued, no realistic hope of resolution, but as a presence, a weight in the national memory that shifts but never lifts. The tent is in a museum. The lake is still there. The peninsula where the teenagers camped is still accessible to anyone who wants to walk down to the water. And somewhere in a filing cabinet, in a laboratory, in the genetic material extracted from a folded pillowcase, there is the DNA of a person who has never been identified, a fifth presence at a crime scene where only 4 people were supposed to be. He may be dead, he may have been dead for decades, but his identity remains unknown, and as long as it does, the case of the Lake Bodom murders cannot close. The loop stays open, the question remains. And Finland keeps asking it, quietly, year after year, on the anniversary of a June night that never fully darkened and never fully ended. If you've made it this far, I'm curious. Do you think it was the Kiosk man, the violent, territorial figure who drowned himself in the same lake and whose wife retracted his alibi on her deathbed? Do you think it was someone else entirely, the unknown fifth male whose DNA has never been matched to any suspect? Or do you think the answer was lying on top of that tent all along, claiming not to remember? Leave a comment and let me know, but before that, have a good rest first.